Lorna did put in the chat that the word of the day is emulate. So that is a word that we need to try and infuse in our speaking this evening. I have the immense pleasure to introduce Kiauna Cote, whose traditional name is K Isqueu, which translates to Hawk Woman in Cree. She is from the Ochapowace First Nation in Treaty 4 territory and is the great-granddaughter of Chief Gabriel Cote, who touched pen at Treaty 4 on behalf of the Saulteaux people. She grew up on the reserve and after high school attended post-secondary school in Regina and earned her bachelor's degree in business administration. She currently works in the Indigenous Relations at Farm Credit Canada and is a member of the FCC Stubble Jumpers Toastmasters Club there. She is a lifelong learner and loves any opportunity to expand her knowledge. Valuing education was one of the many life lessons her great-grandparents have instilled in her. They always encouraged youth to pursue education and work hard. Growing up in her household, she always talked about treaty and inherent rights and she has learned many new things at the First Nations University about what it means to have those rights in today's world. She enjoys learning and speaking of this topic, and I am pleased she is joining us today to share some of that knowledge. On a personal note, she enjoys sports in winter and she plays volleyball. And in summer, she can be found playing softball or having a nice time on the golf course. When not playing sports, she hangs out with her dog Sparky, who also enjoys long walks and Netflix with her. And just a reminder before Kiauna starts, we are recording this session, so if anybody is uncomfortable, just turn off your video with that. So once again, we're very pleased, Kiauna Cote.
Thank you, Toastmaster Leanne. I didn't know you were going to read all of that, but thank you so much, my dog Sparky. Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin this off by acknowledging the Creator and our Mother Earth for another beautiful day. I would then like to acknowledge that we are on unceded, unsurrendered land of Treaty 4 territory, the traditional homeland of the Cree, Soda, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. It is also homeland to the Métis Nation. As you know, my name is Kiauna Cote, and my traditional name is Kekeshkweo, which translates into Hawk Woman. I come from Ochapowace First Nation and grew up in the beautiful Capel Valley. Today, I'm here to speak on the topic of the significance of a land acknowledgement. Indigenous people have always acknowledged the land. They have always had a special connection and relationship with the land, a relationship with our great Mother Earth. We would acknowledge her as she is the first lawmaker. When we acknowledge the land, it's like we acknowledge our mother, the one who takes care of us and gives us life. She is very sacred. Indigenous women play a vital role that has been bestowed upon them from the Creator. That the woman is the protector of the land and the water. We cannot live with neither. A woman is a water carrier, and when her water breaks, there is life. Today, I'm deeply honored to share a little bit of why Indigenous people do land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements have become common since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to actions were released in 2015, urging all governments to change policies and programs to repair the harm caused by residential schools and to move forward with reconciliation. But with the land acknowledgement, they are only the first step. With a land acknowledgement, it opens doors for conversations that Canadians need to have to understand the historical context of the land acknowledgement to remain sincere. There's a responsibility to learn more about the treaties and the first people to occupy this land. Non-Indigenous and Indigenous people have further responsibility and action to educate themselves and make a commitment to the reconciliation process. The number of treaties were pushed because of what was happening to the south of our borders. And there was bloodshed in the states between Indigenous people and the settlers. To avoid war, both parties entered into treaty negotiations. It was negotiated that Indigenous people were going to share the land with settlers to open it up for agriculture. And Indigenous people seen this as a way to transition into a new way of life since the depletion of the buffalo. At treaty, our ancestors agreed to share the land. We never surrendered the land. In Indigenous language, and I'll use Cree for example, there are no words to describe someone owning the land. The earth is our mother, and how does one own their mother? That is Indigenous ideology and worldview. No one can simply own the land. For the number treaty, Treaty 6 is a very prominent treaty as it introduces the medicine chest clause and the famine and pestilence clause. The chiefs that negotiated this treaty said, if we integrate into your way of life, which is agriculture, and if our crops aren't successful, the crown will ensure that our people will be fed. This was in 1876, and at the same time, the Indian Act was created. The Indian Act is a racist, sexist, oppressive piece of legislation that essentially was used to govern every aspect of an Indigenous person's life. It essentially went against what Indigenous people agreed to when they touched pen at treaty. And I say touched pen because in our old tradition, our leaders touched the pen and an X was marked. The spirit and intent of treaties can be represented in the two-row wampum belt. The two-row wampum belt represents two canoes that are parallel from each other, never crossing or disrupting each other's path. Of course, this can extend to neither group will force their laws, traditions, customs, or language onto each other, but will coexist peacefully. Will coexist peacefully as each group follows their own path. This was envisioned when the treaties were made. On September 15th, 1874, the Cree, Assiniboine, and Saulteaux people entered into a sacred covenant called Treaty 4 with the representatives of the British Crown, Queen Victoria. This process took many days to complete, and they sealed this agreement with the pipe. The pipe ceremony symbolizes the creation of a sacred promise, and the treaties themselves are a very sacred promise. Treaty 4 was entered into a government-to-government basis that recognized First Nations sovereignty and governance. Several First Nations bands entered into Treaty 4 later, and the Little Red Schoolhouse, which is now education, was introduced. My great-great-great-grandfather, Chief Gabriel Cote, was a representative for the Saulteaux people. He pushed for education for his people. He understood the world was changing and education will be his people's way of survival in this new world. At that time of treaty negotiation, they withheld his rations for him and his people until he agreed to touch the pen. On a personal note, I would like to extend that I'm living what he envisioned. Today, as a young Indigenous woman who obtained a bachelor's degree at the age of 22, I would not be here if my ancestors did not think of me. Our ancestors thought of generations ahead and thought of the ones that were not yet born to benefit from treaty. Today, I have my own responsibility to do that, to think of the ones that are not yet born, that so they can ensure that they inherit a world that is harmonious like our ancestors once lived. This is why reconciliation is important for the ones that are not yet born, to create a better world. Our people knew that education was the tool for the new climate. Therefore, they requested it in the making of Treaty 4. But let's be clear. Our ancestors never surrendered our children. They never asked for residential schools. Those were imposed by government. Kill the Indian, save the child. With the recent events of the recovery of the unmarked graves at numerous residential schools, they have shook Indigenous nations and people because it reminded us of the horrific history imposed by government that has essentially broke down Indigenous family systems and has left a legacy of intergenerational trauma. I would like to add, I am a daughter of 2 residential school survivors, and I'm the first generation out of residential school. Right now, reconciliation is more important than ever. But land acknowledgements, they're not to instill guilt. They're a way for us to feel more connected to the land that sustains us and to push us to educate ourselves and build relationships. Canada was not founded on an empty space. It was built on Indigenous alongside and on top of Indigenous nations. And those nations still exist today. and have a responsibility to the land. A day before treaty, we had our inherent rights that were given to us from the Creator. And part of that purpose was to be stewards of the land. Our inherent rights include the right to self-government, the rights to the land, to hunt, fish, and trap, and the right to practice our own culture and customs. Those rights are framed in the Canadian Constitution, and they're known as Aboriginal rights. Land acknowledgements highlight the kinship and the relationship Indigenous people have with the land. They also open a platform to implement real change. It breaks the silence that has left Indigenous people deprived of clean drinking water, forced into housing crisis and poverty, disadvantaged in educational opportunities, and destabilized by systematic racism. So it's important we work together to ensure that Indigenous people's rights are being recognized and acknowledged, and that we will have full extent of what our ancestors envisioned when making treaty. So at this time, I ask, what can you do? What can I do? What can we all do to be part of this process? Well, ask yourself, how have you benefited from colonization at the expense of cultures, lives, and livelihood of Indigenous people? What will your contribution to reconciliation be? You can begin this process through education, finding resources of the history of treaty and Indigenous issues, understand your surrounding Indigenous communities, and listen to their stories. Understand that we must honor the treaties. I want to leave you with this today. We are all treaty people, and we all benefit from treaty. Long as the grass grows, river flows, and the sun shines. Thank you.
Thank you so